We also have Emma, who's Open Programme Coordinator at UK Agri-Tech Centre, and Laura, who is Ecosystem Manager at the EIT Food. So we're going to start really just by asking you both to introduce yourselves, a little bit about your background and your roles now. Emma, if it's all right with you, I'll start with you.
Yeah, happily. So yeah, am I back unmuted? Yeah. So Dr. Emma Chapelhow. I grew up in the rural community in Nottinghamshire, so working on farms, Young Farmers Club. I then went to Aberystwyth University to study Environmental Biosciences with agriculture. Then a master's in crop improvement at the University of Nottingham, and then finally my PhD at Newcastle University, collaborating with Ferrous Sciences, and that was all looking at soils and soil microbiomes. So that's my kind of academic background. I now work for the UK Agri-Tech Centre. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with us, but those who aren't, we've been tasked essentially to accelerate innovation in agriculture, whether that be in dairy, beef, all the way to aquaculture, all the arable, horticulture. We cover the whole sector, supporting startups, academics, everyone. My job more in that now is as part of our open innovation programs. Open innovation is an idea to kind of look outside yourselves for innovative new methods and bringing them in. So whether that's outside your team, department, but even your sector. And as part of that, we joined with EIT Food to run this event where we really focused on bringing the supply chain together to find innovative solutions to de-risk the transition. I'll pass it on to Laura for her introduction.
Thank you,
Amazing. Emma. Thanks, Emma. Good morning, everyone. My name is Laura, and I'm an ecosystem manager at EIT Food. My background is actually nothing to do with food and agriculture. So I studied consumer behavior and marketing. That was my major at the University of Reading. So I've always been interested in consumers and how they behave, and how that doesn't always reflect their attitudes towards things. So for me, on the topic of Regen Ag, it's looking at, what are consumer perceptions towards that topic. And then EIT Food, for those of you who haven't heard of us, so we are Europe's largest agri-food innovation initiative. And essentially, we exist to help to accelerate innovation right across the food system, from farm to fork. We are co-funded by the European Institute of Innovation Technology, and we are basically a partner-based organisation. So we work with lots of companies, from industry to RTOs to SMEs to startups, to work on innovation with us. And the UK Agri-Tech Centre are one of our beloved partners. And my relationship with Emma is I'm sort of recently helping to manage their account and our relationship. So we were delighted to co-host this event together. And then finally, just a word on my role. So I'm an ecosystem manager at EIT Food. So my role is to really understand what is happening on the ground when it comes to agri-food innovation. And I'm basically here to look after the partners that are in our wonderful network, and also find other companies that may want to collaborate with us. So if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to get in touch. And I'll pass it back to you, Dan.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Emma. It's clear from those intros the breadth and the depth of experience you both bring to the discussion. So we're really lucky to be able to grill you on certain things today. I thought for context, it was really good that we start with just a bit of an overview on the event that you both organised, that various people, including ourselves, attended. Really, what were the objectives behind that event, and who was represented there? Who were the stakeholders that you were involved in that discussion? Laura, I'm going to hand back to you for that first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course, Dan. So the event that we hosted a couple of weeks ago in Rothamsted was what we kind of called an innovation forum. And the topic was about how can we de-risk the transition to regenerative agriculture using systems thinking. And really the idea was to bring together different agriculture and experts and stakeholders from right across the agri-food supply chain, including farmer cooperatives, startups, producers, manufacturers, academia, retailer, research. So really try and bring people who've got different perspectives on regenerative agriculture in the room. And the event was essentially a series of roundtables where we were looking at the feasibility of transitioning to regenerative agriculture. What is the responsibility of different stakeholders to support the transition, and what are the biggest barriers to this transition? And we looked at things from different angles. So we looked, and this comes with the systems thinking, we looked at how we can transition to Regen Ag from like a One Health angle. So what is the role of human health, animal health, and environmental health? And we also looked at, in terms of, solutions in helping with that transition from different perspectives. So what is the role that finance can play? What is the role policy can play, innovation, education, and things like that?
Thank you, Laura. We're going to try and pull out some of those threads, I think, particularly around barriers and then the solutions that you identified in that workshop. So that'll be really good to get further on that. Emma, in terms of what you were hoping to get out of that event, and also if you can give a sort of real brief intro to systems thinking to a complete novice, I am that complete novice, then that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, so systems thinking is almost kind of what it says on the tin. And I think a lot of the time we have this behavior of, we look at a challenge in a very small box, and rather than looking at the consequences of the solutions or of that challenge on the larger scale. Farming is a very integrated system. It relies on farmers growing the food, processors to buy it, turn it into food products, and then suppliers to sell it, and then obviously the consumer to buy it. So it's heavily embedded in this system all working together. So to tackle challenges and only look at that challenge at the farm level or at the processor level isn't really going to work. And I think we've seen that happen a few times where things have been implemented only focusing on that one stakeholder or that one stage. Systems thinking makes us think, right, if we change this bit in this supply chain, what's the impact? What's the echo that's going to go through the system? And is it going to have negative effects or positive effects further along the supply chain? How are consumers going to act if we add a new chemical to the farm? If we just think, oh yeah, we'll spray this new thing and it gets rid of that pest, that works on the farm level. But how does that affect the processing? How does that affect the consumer behavior, as an example? So systems thinking is really looking at it as a whole, looking at it as a parts, and monitoring how it will change across the whole system. I hope that's kind of clear. And that's kind of with our event, why we got everyone involved, from the farmer, so we had AHGB and a few people like that there, to representatives from Waitrose and Co-op, and consumer kind of insights through people like Grounded Research getting involved.
Thank you, Emma. You can see from that sort of description how the opportunity to have all of those people represented in the room and working together to overcome those challenges was brilliant in terms of outputs. Having done that and having got all of those people together, what were the main barriers all the way across the ecosystem and the supply chain to the more widespread adoption of regenerative agriculture? I'll come back to you on that one, Emma, first.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to add, at the beginning of the day, we asked everyone to rank who they thought was responsible for easing the transition, what they thought the biggest barriers were, and what they thought the solutions were. So we kind of set what people were thinking in the room before we even got started, and we've collected all that data, and hopefully we'll be sharing that soon. And what we then did was repeated that exercise at the end of the day to see if our discussions had led to a change. So I think that's really interesting to see where all the processors were kind of thinking and the supply chain people were thinking initially when they walked in the room. And from an anecdotal side, I watched them go from, oh, well, it's the farmers who need to do it, it's none of us, to then go, oh, well, we'll put the cost on the consumer. But as we kept challenging them, they slowly realised that every single person in the supply chain played a role. and that they all had to get involved. So just like an anecdotal kind of story there of how the day kind of guided that. And that was the first barrier I think we overcame on that day, is that first thing of all, well, it's the farmer. If they want to be regen, they need to do it. To, oh, we'll put all the costs on the consumer. It was really nice to see that first barrier kind of being overcome. On the more literal barriers, I think it mainly came down to finance, which is a really boring answer. Like, we would have loved it to be all new farming practices or new technology, but fundamentally it came down to finance, and conversations were had around studies that were echoing around 5 to 7 years for a regenerative farm to kind of complete the transition and come back up to productivity levels. Who's going to bridge that financial gap over those 7 years? Are there new financial models we can put in, like brokering or premium pricing on regen products? So I think for me, I would say the top barrier highlighted was finance. Laura, would you echo that? Or
Yeah, I would echo that. I would also say another barrier was around farmers perhaps actually already doing a lot of these regenerative practices anyway, but not necessarily defining themselves as regenerative farmers. And I think that was a big part of the conversation as well, is does it matter if farmers don't label themselves as regenerative if they're doing the practices that are part of Regen Ag? And I think we spoke quite a lot about trust and confidence during the day as well, and a big barrier being that farmers might be a bit hesitant to other stakeholders kind of telling them what to do and how to do it, when actually they are the stewards of the land and they've been doing these things for decades. So kind of unpicking trust and how do we build trust right across the supply chain, I think was also a bit of a barrier that we need to try and overcome, along with the big point of finance, which Emma mentioned.
There's no way we can move away from the financing of any of these changes, is there? And it's, yeah, something we see a lot, that it comes back to that. Enlightening, but maybe not totally surprising to see that in the initial discussions, everybody felt the responsibility sat elsewhere within that supply chain. But then equally, you show the sort of benefit of bringing all of those stakeholders together. I want to just come back to sort of the labelling of the practices as regen in a minute. But before we do, given the advantages you found of bringing all of those stakeholders together, where do you think the responsibility for that sits in the future? Clearly, we need that discussion to move forward, and you've taken it in this instance. But where does that sit going forward for it to be a sort of sustainable and worthwhile discussion? Laura, what are your thoughts?
I mean, ultimately, I think we do need multiple stakeholders, you know, from farm to fork involved in the conversation. And I think that's what I loved about this event. It was, you know, a really good example of bringing multiple stakeholders together. But I think what was clear is that you need an orchestrator or a facilitator to help get the commitment across the supply chain, because ultimately all stakeholders involved, you know, we all have our own kind of objectives and intentions and things that we need to do. So that's what I really liked about, you know, EIT Food and the UK Agri-Tech Centre playing this kind of orchestrator role of, you know, we're kind of neutral. We want to kind of bring everyone together and kind of help facilitate the conversation, but not own it. So I really liked that. I think we also need to think about the importance of having more types of these conversations, because people aren't going to commit to things straight away. People need to build this trust and rapport that I was mentioning. So I think, you know, providing opportunities for these types of conversations to happen in the future, and Emma and I have discussed this, you know, how can we even make this an ongoing conversation with our event? Because yeah, to get that commitment with everyone, it takes time. And even, you know, getting everyone in the room, I think we had very good representation, but again, perhaps we could have got even more organizations involved. So yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Thanks, Laura. Emma, how do you feel we scale these discussions and we sort of ingrain them in the industry going forward, all the way from farm up to consumer?
Yeah, I think there's been many efforts before, and we see organisations like the UK Agri-Tech Centre, EIT Food, the AHDB, people like that trying to encourage these discussions, but again, almost siloed. And obviously with all of our own agendas in the back of our minds. So we definitely went into this event trying to make sure our agenda wasn't put on. Obviously, as the UK Agri-Tech Centre, we wanted them to say, we need a brand new tractor, and we wanted to run off and try and build that, but that's not what was happening. And I think just to take a step back and just kind of add to what Laura was saying, we went into that and we gave the team that came into that room a strict set of rules on things that they were allowed to talk about. That I think is why the day was such a success. So, for instance, we said you were not allowed to try and define Regen Ag, right? Which lots of people tried to keep sneaking it back in. And we said, that's not what the day's about. And if we get stuck down that rabbit hole, we're all going to be there, and we can all argue what we think Regen Ag is. So we had to come in as that facilitator and set rules like that to make sure that the day stayed on track of what we were wanting. But in terms of scaling it, I think it's a really hard question. And it's one of the things that's keeping me up at night post this event. And me and Laura have started this, but we've done this amazing event. We've got loads of data, we've got loads of information. How on earth do we keep this ball rolling? How on earth do we make sure there's impact? And even on the day, people coming up to us and being like, well, what are you doing next? What's next? And we were like, oh, well, we don't know. The day's it's still running. We haven't slept on it yet. And I think, to me, I don't have the answer yet. And I'm hopefully, me and Laura are going to talk a bit more, look at what we found out. But that's always the risk of these conversations, and where a lack of trust has come from in the past is people get brought into the room and then nothing happens. And so how do we ensure that that happens? And then I'd like to think if we start showing impact from these days, they will naturally scale and they will naturally be repeated because people are seeing the value.
Thank you. Yeah, ongoing challenge, but certainly one that's worthwhile overcoming. I think staying away from that definition is sensible to a point to keep the discussion moving forward. Otherwise, you just get hung up on there. And so we won't go over that. But just there was some important points around that. One is, do we think there is a danger in labelling practices like that? So Laura, you alluded to the point that actually many farmers are doing what we might describe as environmentally positive farming, but not labelling it as Regen Ag. Is there a danger that by calling it something, we possibly exclude people, or we introduce some sort of divisiveness to the discussion? Laura, I'm going to head back to you for that because you touched on it before.
Yeah, sure. I think, and this was also a part of the conversation at the event, is regenerative agriculture going down the same route as organic farming, and how, you know, products labelled as organic has almost created a point of differentiation for farmers, a point of competitive advantage. And I think the conversation on the day was, well, regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, that should be the way that all food is produced. So should it go down that route of being a point of differentiation or a point of competitive advantage for farmers and food producers? And I think you also do have to think about the consumer part, and that was the way I was coming in at it, because if you think about when we buy food and we go to the supermarket and, you know, we're being quick with our decisions, we're grabbing food, we don't necessarily always look at labels that are on our food as well. And that was another point of discussion. I know someone said, well, you know, you've got the leaf bark standard, which you're doing, which is brilliant. But is there a point of having a regenerative agriculture label as well? And this was a big part of the conversation, which is, you know, do consumers want such a label? Would it actually help or hinder the situation? I don't have the answer. I don't know, but I think, yeah, we do really have to think about the labeling side of things, and yeah, be really mindful with this route of regenerative agriculture. I think it's very much seen as quite a trendy kind of buzz kind of topic at the moment. But I really hope it becomes one of those things which, all food, we want to try and be produced in this way. And I don't want it to go down that route of organic. That's just my perspective. Yeah, I'll hand back to you, Dan. Or Emma, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Emma.
No, I think I kind of echo that. Was one of our solutions that we explored was like regenerative ag certification, like the red tractor logo organic thing. And again, it came back to pushing easing the transition on the consumer again. And as you said, consumers shouldn't be the one paying for it, I don't think. And all food should be produced sustainably in the future. Whether that we call that regen, whether we call that organic, whatever we call that, it should be sustainable. But I think there is an element whilst we go through this transition of there being some sort of support and accreditation to farmers that are doing it. So there is that a reward, but also they start knowing that they're doing it right. If we say there's no definition to regen ag or do whatever you want, there's going to be some farmers doing it wrong. I don't know if wrong's the right word, but do you know what I mean? So having organizations like Leaf to like support farmers and pushing them down the right routes, offering that support. So whilst this transition is happening, they are getting that kind of acknowledgement of taking on this task and doing it well. But in the future, long term, all food should be sustainable, and whether that's regen or not, I don't know. But I think that's my perspective.
Thank you both. It sounds like you share similar views there, but it really illustrates the complexity of the discussion, doesn't it? And particularly around regenerative agriculture as a principle-based approach. There's a lot of experimentation and failure in there that's a really important point, and the context of your own farm and not being too prescriptive. So with all of that in mind and the points you've both raised, how then do you address some of the challenges around measuring and validating both the practices and the outcomes, given the range of sort of approaches that can be taken, and how the end consumer can become very confused by all of that? Very wide-ranging question. I apologise for that, but I just wanted to draw out some of your views on it. Emma?
Yeah, I mean, it's a conversation that came up and it led to loads of other rabbit holes on the day that we didn't foresee. There's obviously like a load of amazing technologies out there that measure things like biodiversity, soil health. But bringing it back to the financial conversation we had, quite often we were saying, well, how do we put value on nature and on these environmental goods? And that's still a massive question mark. I won't go into the carbon markets, but obviously that's the one that's rising to the top. So do we start measuring that? As a soil scientist, I heavily question how people are measuring carbon. What carbon are they measuring? How it fluctuates? And similarly, like, how do we measure biodiversity? So there's cool tech out there that listens to bird song or bee noise and can tell you who's flying around. But then similarly relating that to whether the regen practice is the one that's caused those increases in environmental goods. I think the way that our society is going is we're incredibly data driven, whether that's in farming or anywhere else. And that is a conversation, again, that was spoke about on the day, is that data driven decision making on farm is something that's constantly being pushed. The government are using it to make choices. We're seeing AI, machine learning, everything. It's all got to be driven by data. So we do need to figure out a way of measuring this and collecting this data so we can prove that we are becoming sustainable and doing these regen ag practices and potentially using it as a metric. And it's so hard, like you said, Dan, this is a massive question, but it also led us down the route of, do we reward farmers for just taking on the practices, or do we reward farmers for the increase in environmental goods that they've achieved? And then we started talking about the risk of plateaus, or even hypothetically, and I'd like to believe no one ever would do this, damaging your farm to get it low, so then you can bring it really easily back up and receive a larger payment. I don't think anyone would do that. I wouldn't like to believe that for a second, but it does allow room for people to play with the system, which we're kind of seeing with the, dare I say it, SFI payments. So really hard question. I think fundamentally we will have to figure out a way of measuring these things. How do we put value on them is an even bigger question.
I think you do touch on a really important point there, Emma, in that there is an argument around people who have been doing a lot of positive things for a long time, and so their benchmark maybe is much higher, their gain is therefore less. Are they rewarded less than the people who are starting from a very low point and increasing things up there? So yeah, big discussion.
I think I'd just love to jump in there, and this is a wider conversation that perhaps we can do on another leaf surgery, but it raised the question of, if we're generating this data, who owns the data and how do we stop this data being used maliciously? And again, jumping all the way back to much earlier on in the conversation, Laura talking about trust there. If I as a farmer share my data to the supply chain, I need to know that they're going to use that for my best interest and the best interest of the food security of the country, not, oh, well, these are our lowest performing farms, we're going to cut them out of the contract and things like that. And that was a fear that was shared with us from farmer representatives of this moving into this data-driven society. And if supply chains are going to fund the data collection, are they going to argue that they own it, or does the farmer own it? And so it's a bigger conversation there that we're moving into, a new crazy world where there's all this data flying around. Who is responsible, and how do we make sure it's used with the best intentions?
And maybe if I can just jump in really quickly, I mean, yes, absolutely to everything that Emma said. And I think I was on a specific roundtable at the event that was talking about, data, yes, it's the way the world's going, but we don't want to become so reliant on it that we forget that, again, coming back to the point earlier, a lot of farmers, they've got great initiative. They've been doing these things for years. And how do we kind of marry data-driven decisions, but also kind of using your initiative, using your past experience, knowing your land? How do we kind of marry those two together? Just wanted to add that.
No, thank you both. There's certainly examples in the fairly recent past of where data has perhaps been used to detrimentally impact producers. So I can see why there would be a sense of nervousness there, most definitely. And that whole question around ownership is really important. If anyone in the audience has any questions, please pop them in the chat. They can either go to everyone or directly to Victoria, who can field them. We have to pull on the thread of finance. And whilst it is a huge discussion, I don't think we'd be doing the discussion justice if we didn't look at maybe what some of those solutions could be. So I'd be really interested from both of you to know if you have any examples of where external finance has come in and really helped that transition, how that's worked in practice, and whether those are things that we could look to scale, or were they fairly niche examples. Laura, I see you nodding, so I'm going to direct it straight back to you to hear your experiences of that.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So maybe just an example of what EIT Food has been doing on this is blending kind of private and public money. And what we have been doing is a project based on a co-financing model to try and scale regenerative agriculture across different geographical landscapes in Europe. And what we've been doing is EIT Food contributing a pot of money, but also looking to industry partners to contribute to a pot of money. So we've been working with the likes of Cargill and Danone and Intermalta. And what we found is why that's worked is because you've got different people coming together and contributing to a pot of money, you're able to get a larger sum generated to be able to run a program that hopefully is going to have bigger impact, bigger scale. And the program that we've been running involves providing farmers with financial support, coupled with training, farmer training around working with agronomists and other experts about how they can create a regenerative agriculture farm across a number of years. So again, looking at more long-term support rather than, here's a bit of training, go off and do it. But how can we create a transitional plan over a number of years that takes into account financial strains? And we try and take some of that financial strain by putting in funding along with industry partners. And it's something we've been piloting last year in Spain. We're hoping to replicate the model in other parts of Europe, including the UK and Ireland. But yeah, that kind of blended co-financed approach for us so far seems to be working. And again, creating this kind of pre-competitive environment for collaboration, because for us, all of our industry partners benefit from doing this because we're doing it together rather than doing it alone. So yeah, for us, that's been working quite well.
Thank you, Laura. That sort of brings us back around again, doesn't it, to the measurement and validation of the impacts as well, and how the people who are helping to fund that have that information about the positive impacts there. Emma, what examples and thoughts do you have on how we can finance this and where we can bring in potentially private finance or possibly delivered through consumer and markets as well?
Yeah, so finance is probably where I would say I'm the weakest, and I might not have the best answer to this question, but I had a really interesting conversation on the day with a representative from Oxbury Bank who left me with a sentiment I thought could be spread across all the supply chain when we're trying to convince them to invest in this. He shared that they have a product that they have a lower interest rate on their loans for farmers who are taking up regenerative practices. And we can have lots of discussions there around what regen is and how they are calling the shots on that one. And I said to him, well, how comes you can do that? How can you take that interest hit with that farmer so you're making less of a profit? And he said, because they're making more resilient farms, they're going to be around for longer, so we'll have them for a customer for longer. And that resonated with me, and that's something that all the supply chain can think of. Well, if we support them and we financially invest now to make them a more resilient farm, they're going to be here in 10, 20, 50 years, meaning this small investment today actually saves us a lot of money in the long run in the supply chain. So even though initially when I had that conversation with him, I was like, well, farmers shouldn't be taking out loans, blah, 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 blah. That sentiment, I think, is what's really important. Regen Ag creates resilient farms that are going to be around for longer, meaning your investment today isn't a short-term investment, it's a long-term investment.
Thank you. I think that tells us a lot, doesn't it, about the financial institutions you're on it, and certainly at Leaf through our work with HSBC and Oxbury on those schemes, that's exactly the message we get. And if they can look at how they validate and measure the practices that farmers are implementing, then they're really happy to support those. And in the bank's case, it's through those preferential loan rates. But we would hope that would be expanded throughout the sort of ecosystem that supports farmers as well. When we're having some of the discussions and we're looking at some of the data around things like climate change and biodiversity loss, the future can look a little bit bleak. Those of us in the industry know there's reasons to be very optimistic about the future, but I'd be interested to capture both of your specific views on why we should feel that farming has a lot to deliver, and actually the future of food production and farming in combination with nature recovery is a really warming place to be, and something we should be very hopeful about. Emma, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's a hard question that to me seems like it has a really obvious answer, but when you start pulling it becomes a bit scary, doesn't it? To me, fundamentally, we need food to live. I'm a soil scientist, so perhaps I'm a bit more averse to the whole vertical farm idea, but if I feel like if we moved into this world where we were living in vertical farms, it would be a dystopian hell as far as I'm concerned. So for me, food is fundamental. There isn't a question of whether we should or shouldn't become more sustainable. It has to. We won't be needing food for the rest of the human race's time on Earth. And if we look back in history, they've always gone hand in hand. And if you think about it, nature and producing food cannot exist without each other. So to me, it's like a really, it's a black and white answer. Like, of course we should do this. And of course, whether we think it's going to be successful, whether we think it's doom and gloom, there is no question but to try. And I don't know if that's like the most insightful answer in the world, but if we do nothing, that will be the end. So we have to. And I think positively. I speak to farmers, people working in this sector every day, and they bring me hope, and everyone seems so positive. If they weren't positive, perhaps I wouldn't be able to come to work every day. But at the same time, it's scary, right? And I think there's lots of things that we could be moving quicker than they are. I feel a lot of that lies in policy. And it is a question, I think, that's coming out of the day that we had government role and policy role kept coming up. And how do we as EIT Food and UK Agri-Tech Centre motivate policy change? I don't know. So yeah, sorry, a bit of a roundabout answer there, but I hope I've given my perspective at least.
You definitely have, and you've actually brought out another question, but I'll hand over to Laura in a sec for her views. But I would agree that actually there's a huge amount of positivity, there's a huge amount of innovation and a willingness within the industry to change. It's just that the messages and the long-term planning need to be there to facilitate that. Laura, I'd be really interested to get your views on why we should be optimistic about the future and the role that food production and farming has in that.
Sure. I mean, firstly, kind of echoing Emma's point, which is, I mean, we have no choice but to be optimistic. We have to be, because the risk of not acting is higher than the risks associated with us acting on this. And I agree, we can't transform the food system overnight, but we can take steps in the right direction, and we are taking steps in the right direction. And for me, I think we should be optimistic because we know this stuff works as well. You know, when we look at farmers who have been doing regenerative agriculture and farming sustainably, we know that, you know, they've got increased biodiversity, they've got higher quality soil, they've got increased water absorption. So we know these things are working. And I think the food system in general gets a very bad reputation for being a contributor to climate change. But actually, I think what's exciting is that it holds so many of the solutions to it as well, with carbon sequestration and so many other things. So I think we should be hopeful. And what I love about my role at EIT Food is that I get to see so many of these innovations, new business models, new solutions from a variety of companies. And there's such a willingness to work together on this. And I agree with Emma, we just need a bit of the buy-in from the top, I think, to get us there. But yeah, I think we have to be hopeful. We've got no other option. And we can do this together. I agree with Emma, it's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight. But I do feel optimistic because I know that the solutions are there as well. And one thing I'm really excited about, and I know we lack research on this at the moment, but is the link between you know, food that's produced regeneratively and the food then having a higher nutritional value. There seems to be research going into that as well, which I find really fascinating. So yeah, I feel optimistic, even though it can be quite daunting sometimes.
I share that optimism, definitely.
Good.
Where can people go to see the outputs from the workshop and the next stages? It sounds like it was brilliant bringing those people together that you did, and there was some really good discussions. I'm sure we're all wanting to see, well, actually, the data you've pulled out of that, what does it tell us? Where can we find that, and when can we expect it to come out?
Yeah, so that's falling on me. So I'm hoping to get Laura today our first draft of the initial kind of event outputs, looking at that first round of data. We'll then probably be sharing that around the delegation, and then happy to share it with Leaf as well. That will be going to your team that attended the event. Beyond that, we're then due to kind of really start digesting it at that next level. So myself and Laura have got more time scheduled in. Now we've transcribed everyone's wonderful handwriting to really start pulling out even higher level kind of outputs and suggestions. We'll be looking to produce a business case or some sort of report that will be put out publicly, and then everyone can have access to that as well. And then beyond that, hopefully we'll be pulling out some real next steps, and we'll be interacting with the stakeholders that we think can help push those next steps forwards, whether that be through working groups or I don't know, like accelerated programs, or in any way we then see. But the event was last week, so we're still quite early on, but it was fantastic to come and talk to you guys today whilst it's still so fresh in our minds.
Thank you, Emma, and we will definitely keep a lookout for that, and we'll use our Leaf networking mechanisms to get that information out to people. Emma, Laura, I'd like to thank both of you. It's been really interesting. Inevitably, there's no way we're going to produce all the answers, but there's definitely been some common threads there. I think there isn't a single answer. There's not a single answer for de-risking or for financing, but all of the stakeholders and all of the points within the ecosystem and supply chain have to be involved in the discussion. Otherwise, it's too easy to put the responsibility onto other people that aren't there. So we really appreciate your insights. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Our next Leaf surgery is a spotlight on peat, and that's going to be the 11th of April. So similar sort of conversational approach to that, and how we can protect and enhance peat within our farmed environment. But final thank you again go to Emma and Laura. Really appreciate your time and your insights, and hopefully we will see the outputs, and we'll see you all at the next surgery. Thank you, everyone, and have a great day.